All right, everybody, thanks so much for joining us today for CCL's Big Tent Climate Talks. This conversation is the monthly series we're hosting that spotlights diverse leaders in the climate community. At CCL, we know that solving climate change requires a variety of policies and perspectives, as Kevin was kind of just alluding to a moment ago, if you were already tuned in. And this is why we do this work under a big tent. That includes from the right, the left, and every spot in between. In our Big Tent Climate episodes, we'll talk to a wide variety of climate leaders outside of CCL to learn more about how we can work better together. For starters, I'm Kyle Kammien. I'm the Senior Business Relations Representative in our DC office or for CCL. My work focuses on building the coalition of businesses and industry partners in our Big Tent. Overall, our DC team focuses on keeping a pulse on what other organizations are doing and finds ways that CCL can collaborate with them, as well as the legislative work. It is my hope that our session today gives you a taste of how our teams with conversations with other organizations go and allows you to learn a lot about Nature for Justice, our guest Kevin Bryan's organization. So we are so pleased to be hosting a conversation with Kevin Bryan, the co-founder and managing director at Nature for Justice. And he's also the principal and owner at Equinevol Partners, LLC. Before we jump into our conversation, just want to establish our regular ground rules. It's a bit of a back and forth conversation, more than a one-way presentation, so it might feel a bit different than a typical event you've come to for CCL in the past. A few gentle reminders. We love our focus on our policy, but we are open-minded. Today's focus is on listening to and learning from the experiences of fellow climate advocates and other groups. If you bump into a moment that you think or feel differently about, lean into that, see it as an opportunity to learn about the larger climate movement and better understand different perspectives. In the vein of building support for policy, we know that it will require the biggest and broadest coalition possible, and that is the reason we want to host conversations like this one. Learning from each other and working together is how we get the job done. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's guest. A little bit more about Kevin. Kevin Bryan has 20 years of experience building coalitions, developing organizational strategy, and fostering collaboration between organizations to support the growth of promising organizations and opportunities for people of color. He currently advises national organizations and coalitions as they shift their program frameworks to incorporate equity and justice. Kevin, is there anything else that you would like folks on this call to know about your background that I might have missed in that introduction?
I think that's it. Some of this will probably, there's a lot more, but they'll probably come out in the conversation.
Thank you so much. We're very fortunate to have you as our guest on this month's Big Tent Climate Talk. Let's transition into our conversation so I can stop doing all the talking. That's not why we're here. Also for the audience, don't worry, we have saved time for your questions at the bottom of the hour for audience Q&A. For this first part, I'm going to be asking Kevin for his perspectives and experiences with some questions we have queued up. And then after we get through those and other conversation, we'll dive into the Q&A. So first, Kevin, this is a big question. I'm sure it has a long story, but how did you get involved in the climate movement? What was the impetus? How did that happen?
Wow. Well, I can tell you how. I'm not really certain that I remember, to be honest. I can tell you how I got interested in environmental issues.
Yeah, great.
I'm actually I'm not in my normal abode in DC, Washington, DC today. I'm actually in North Carolina. I'm on the road doing some outreach to some folks that we're planning to be working with over the course of the next couple of years. I grew up here in North Carolina. And I'm actually in Raleigh-Durham area right now. And in the early 80s, I remember I was 11 years old, and I remember hearing on TV every day or every other day conversations about dumping along highways in some of the counties nearby here in North Carolina. Particularly when you get into the northeastern part of the state, you're talking about some of the poorest counties in the state. And those are oftentimes people of color, Black, Latino people, folks who are bearing the brunt of a broad set of environmental injustices. And in this case, it was dumping of PCBs along the highways in Warren County. And for those of you who know about the history of the environmental justice movement, this was the beginning of it. We didn't know it at the time, but we just knew that this was, I'm 11 years old. I didn't really understand a lot, but I knew that this was wrong. And I also knew it sounded eerily familiar to other things that I was hearing. It's amazing how perceptive young kids are, and how much they can understand. So that's how I got interested in this.
Yeah.
I didn't become a 16-year-old activist like a Mustafa Ali, but I did stay interested in the issues. And even as I, went on to Howard and studied civil engineering there, I was very interested in the political side of science and just got more deeply into it. Went off to an environmental advocacy organization, Environmental Defense Fund, after school and started working there for a few years, but really got interested in this idea of uh, collaborative problem solving. How do we shift the table of power? That's what I was really interested in. I had seen some opportunities where they had these multi-stakeholder groups, and all of a sudden, there could be people at the table who didn't normally have their voices heard. And I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to figure out how to do that more deeply. Um, that led me into some of these ideas around, um, that led me into some of the work around looking at renewable energy, wind, solar, and that got me into the climate movement.
That's fascinating. And I have to say, you said that you studied civil engineering, and I had a moment where we actually share something in common. When I started school, when I started college, I was studying civil engineering, and I had a moment where I thought, I'm not sure this is what I want to do. I'm interested in policy and politics, and I ended up finishing my degree in economics and moving into public policy space. But I
Yeah,
started as a civil engineer for 2 years, so just an
I
odd.
almost did that. I almost made that shift. I almost made the shift to econ and history,
Well,
but
we have
I
something in
decided to
common.
stick with, I stuck with the engineering piece.
Well, thank you so much for that, for giving us that background. It's really helpful in understanding your experiences, and pivoting more towards where you work now with Nature for Justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about the areas of focus and the projects that Nature for Justice is working on?
Yeah, Nature for Justice is really focused on both international and domestic projects. We've got work around the globe, all of it focused on how do we take nature-based solutions and make these tools for uh, enabling communities to exercise their agency and build their communities and make certain that they are empowered to really address the issues that are impacting their everyday lives. How do they take the power that they have and really grow that and use it for the benefit of their livelihoods, their communities, the individuals in those communities. So that's what we really want to focus on. Um, we've got some work going on with First Nations in Canada. We've got work going on in Ghana, all of it around thinking about how do we use land as ways to not only improve environmental conditions, but to generate benefits, whether they be cultural benefits, economic benefits, that accrue back to those communities. You also got quite a bit of work going on here in the United States, and one of those is a project that I'm leading around Black farmers. We're looking at Black and Indigenous farmers here in the U.S., particularly looking at the Southeast U.S., and thinking about what are the barriers as these farmers are facing more climate disruption, and how does Nature for Justice really connect uh, institutional partners, technical
Sure.
advisors with these communities, create a create a relationship between those communities, so a
Yeah.
two-way relationship where they can learn from one another and think about what are the best ways to support these communities as they look to improve farming methods, as they look to the ways to think about how to increase access to capital, access to markets, access to technology and information. You know, and that's what we're looking at. And those are the kinds of projects that we're working.
That's Wow, that's a lot. It's such important work. It's a
Yeah, it
lot of
is.
work. You're really
It's a
diving
lot.
into, right? It's you said a couple of things that I think are aligned, with CCL's value. You said empower, and I know that that's something that CCL is really committed to for its volunteers. We want to empower our volunteers, to really
Yeah,
take action. So I think that's a value that our organizations share in common. There is finding a way to
yeah.
empower.
Well, I think, and I want to be careful with this term empower, because I've run across some people who criticize that term because they
Okay.
believe that they believe it's a paternalistic term. And I think there are some ways in which it could be viewed. It could be utilized, yes, as it's very paternalistic. Um, I, I think, and the comment can be that uh, you don't recognize the power that people already have.
Okay.
And I want to make certain that, you know, there is intrinsic worth, intrinsic value, inherent worth that each of us has.
Yes.
And that assumes that because you have this inherent worth, there is a power that all of us have internally. Now, be frank, that power there are others who attempt to snuff out that power that individuals have. And they attempt to exercise power over those groups. And what we want to do is to try to break that cycle. Can we jump in the middle of this? Can we identify some of those patterns that consistently limit access to resources? When I think about equity and justice, I really define equity as access to, really think about this as access to decision-making and power structures. And think about it as access to the resources, benefits, and opportunities that come from those decision-making power structures. Justice is then the recognition that not everybody has that access.
Yeah.
And it's the acknowledgement of that, the public acknowledgement of it, and then thinking about how do we remedy that? What are the remedies that we then put in place? So that, in my view, is how I identified equity and justice. And thinking about those two things, we have a theory of change of how we want to address our work with Black and Indigenous farmers. And it is about access. And I started rattling that off, access to capital, access to markets, access to technology and knowledge, and access to secure land. What are the things that we need? What are the things that we can do, that we can bring to the table? What are the relationships and connections that Nature for Justice can bring to the table to actually address those issues of access?
Eliminating those barriers.
Eliminate those barriers, address those injustices. That's what we want to do. There's some, and a lot of times we're connecting the dots. We want to build trusted networks we want to reach into trusted networks, connect with people who are trusted on the ground by those communities, and then make certain that we're helping to expand those networks. And this is how we start talking about scaling the work that we do. A lot of it is network based. A fair amount of it is bringing resources to the table, reaching out to some of those folks that we might know in the funding community, in the capital markets community, pairing them with folks who on the ground have been doing regenerative farming for a couple of centuries. They don't call it regenerative farming. They're doing this, but they've been doing this work for a long time. Bring their knowledge to the table. Exactly. So that's a lot of what we're attempting to do. And we are working hard we're learning. We are certainly not above the ability to learn. We're going to have to, if we want to meet the mission of our organization.
I think Kyle may have frozen there, so I'll take over here, Kevin, just for a little moment until I have Kyle rejoin. This is so incredibly helpful. And the next question that our volunteers would love to know a little bit more about is, what do people assume about your work with Nature for Justice that actually isn't true, or some of the things that people might not expect with some of your day-to-day outreach?
Ooh, I think we're such a new organization. We've been around now for about a year. I think we're still learning who we are as an organization. I don't know if there's I think some of the things that organizations might wonder about us, we're trying to figure out ourselves. We do know that we're committed to thinking about this differently than a lot of environmental organizations have operated in the past. We really want to build networks, build partnerships with the folks that we're working with in communities. And that's different, frankly, than a lot of environmental organizations. I think they come in, recently this has started to change, but I think it's always been, here's a solution we think is a great solution, you all ought to take it. And it's not been one of really building deep partnerships with these communities, thinking about how funding gets to these communities, making certain that they can be full partners in these relationships. This is part of that paternalistic engagement that I think has been part of the mainstream environmental community for 30, 40 years. It's got to change. We have to do things differently if we really want to start winning some of these battles. So that's a big thing. That's a big difference that we want to bring to the table. Even on our board, we are setting up our board to really include folks from the communities that we engage with. So as we build out our board, we want to make certain it's not just folks with deep pockets. We want to make certain that there is a sizable portion. We want half of our folks, our board members, to be from the communities that we work with. We want them to be able to tell us, what should we be working on? How should we be articulating this work? Who should we be engaging with? That's really important to us. So we want to do things differently than environmental organizations have done to date.
Thank you, Kevin. Sorry about that. My internet dropped off very suddenly there, so I apologize.
I was afraid it was mine.
No, it was mine. I apologize, but I wanted to thank you for, you did it again in that question too. I wanted to thank you for kind of walking us through your theory of change, because I think that really helps understand the context in which Nature for Justice is working. And so I appreciate that. That was really helpful. And the next kind of question that we had was, you've laid out a lot of work that you're doing. But is there anything like this week or month that is a major focus or program that Nature for Justice has that you're primarily focused on?
Literally, in 3 hours, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to spend my evening talking with some folks who have a network of farmers here in North Carolina. We're thinking of, we're building our program and thinking about, how do we get some of our partners who are going to be looking at issues around soil science and comparing notes on what farmers are already doing around regenerative farming in their communities. I'm going to get up tomorrow morning, do a strategy session with some of these folks, and then I'm getting on the road. I'm going to Virginia and talking to folks there and doing this all over in the afternoon. So, I'm actually going to get a chance to be on a farm, have a good old lunch of food from the ground.
Fresh food.
Is fresh food from the ground. What could be better than that? So, that's where we are. We are on the ground, on the road, talking to folks and trying to build out this program. We're at our very beginning stages and with this particular work, and really excited about the opportunities that are in front of us.
That's great. You are. I come back to you're very busy. So to that end, thinking about how as we talked about, this is a big tent, and it's going to take a lot of us working together to really make meaningful impact on climate change. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on how we can all be in this movement together? What are your thoughts on what CCL could do to be the most helpful or impactful?
You all have a structure that allows you to really be engaged and build partnerships and relationships with people in communities around the country, particularly those communities that have not always been a part of those discussions. They've been talked at and not partnered with.
That's the
And I
paternal
think
thing you were talking about before.
that is exactly. And I
Yeah.
think that is the real opportunity here that CCL has. You know, you have an opportunity to really kind of build those relationships, work with people on the ground, listen to folks to understand what's most important to them. You know, we did, and one of the big pieces of work that I did in my life was around trying to get Waxman-Markey bill passed and working with a group called the United States Climate Action Partnership, what, 10, almost 15 years ago now, was the start of that effort. We eventually kind of built some ideas for legislation. Some of that turned into a Waxman-Markey bill. We got it through the House, we tried to get through the Senate, and we weren't successful. I say every day, and I think about this every day because I use it to focus what I'm trying to do now. I wish we had done that different. I wish that we had paid more attention to the opportunities that were in front of us. I wish we had done a much better job of network building and reaching out to folks and not assume that we could just get something done through DC, through the legislative arm. Let's get the power brokers at the table. And you really need to get folks in communities across America to be supportive of this so that they go to those same power brokers and say, you need to vote for this. You all have the power to do that. You have the reach to do that. And I would really implore you to understand that ability. Make certain that you're reaching out to these communities. Make certain that your own staffs, the people within your organization reflect those communities, so that when you reach out to them, you know, it's not as if those communities don't turn back and say, well, who's just coming to talk to me? Make certain you go to those communities and get some of those people to be part of the organization, and so that you can support them, and they can support you in a really mutually beneficial relationship.
Thank you for that. And I think you're spot on that we have chapters everywhere, right? We have chapters across the country in every congressional district. So you're absolutely right. And, 200,000 volunteers. So you're right. We definitely have reach to build such important relationships via the sheer number of people we have in our network. Thank you for that. So then kind of tying that into, CCL's goals, what is Nature for Justice's thoughts on rising prices on greenhouse gas emissions and dividends? And then simultaneously though, as an opening, what would be the ideal or preferred way of, designing ambitious climate policy for Nature for Justice?
I want to make certain here that I'm expressing my views, because I think at Nature for Justice, we're really still thinking this through. We've had some conversations, but we are still having we're still having some conversations. I want to be clear about that. I think it's important for us to recognize that there are a lot of tools. One of the mistakes that I think we made in the past was not using all the tools that we had in front of us. We made an assumption back in 2008, 2009, 2010, that we had to have this big, broad federal climate bill. It had to be economy-wide. Somebody said, at the time, we were also talking about the Affordable Care Act. And if that's 1/60 of the economy, then this bill is going to Waxman-Markey is going to deal with the other 5/6. And I just think that was a mistake. We use all the tools in the tool shed. I know that in the instance of capital trade systems, markets, carbon pricing, you eventually get into offsets and credits, and people have different levels of comfort with those, and some people are very uncomfortable with those different ideas. I think we make a mistake when we simply say, no, we can't do that. Let's really think about how all of those tools can be part of this mosaic that we're going to have if we're going to try to approach and address these issues. We can make certain that all of the issues that come around markets, pricing, that we address those issues in a way that communities aren't going to be harmed by those rules, and in fact that they are lifted up in them. We can do that. It's not impossible. So that's just my thinking on it. I think, I've got some friends that disagree with me vehemently on this. But I believe if we approach it from that viewpoint, all of these tools can be used.
Thank you for that context. And I think, a couple things that come to mind that I know, we talk about it at CCL are, on one hand, definitely seeing that, a price is not, we're definitely advocates for a price, of course, that's, but we understand that it's not a silver bullet in the sense that there are going to be lots of other pieces of this solution. And that's where I think CCL has really grown in the last few years, is focusing on additional bills that we can support, such as the Reclaim Act or the Growing Climate Solutions Act, the Hope for Homes Act, et cetera, that the point being that there are going to be other things that need to be addressed in this process, and that it is not, there isn't a silver bullet, even if that we believe that, a price is the foundation of that. It's still not a silver bullet, and that there are other issues that need to be addressed. And I think when it comes to a price itself, that's one of the reasons that with the recent introduction of Senator Whitehouse's bill about his office thinking about how they could design a price in a way that was more focused on, or trying to be more focused on equity and listening to communities that are concerned. And so hopefully, that was, we think that was an important step in kind of the pricing discussion about what the impacts are.
Yeah, I would just encourage folks, be a part of the conversation. Don't walk away from the conversation. Don't shut the conversation down. Because, there's an opportunity to extract some of the things that you want, some of the gains that you're looking for from that conversation. But you can only do that if you're at the table, being a part of that discussion. If you say, no, we're just not going to talk about that, and I just think that puts you in a position where you don't have, where you're looking for another source of power in order to get what you want. So just use all of those opportunities. Is just the way I would encourage folks to think.
Great, thank you. So a little bit of a pivot before we jump into audience questions, but what, this could be anything. What's at the top of your stack? What have you been reading? I know you're very busy, you're on the road, but have you been reading anything lately that you'd recommend to others and to our audience here?
I will tell you, I am actually I've been reading a lot about Pilates and wine, because I'm actually training to be a certified wine specialist and a Pilates instructor. So that's going to be kind of that's awesome. This is my opportunity to do something and give back in a totally different way than my career choices. So that's what I'm paying the most attention to. I'm not reading enough. I need to read more so that I can take these tests. But for me, both of those things are kind of the way I reconnect with myself and with others. Pilates is just this whole kind of mind-body connection thing. I don't even know what to call it. Some people call it exercise. It's way more than exercise for me. It's just this connection to my body. And I'll be honest, I take way better care. I still have a long way to go, but I take way better care of my body today than I did 5 years ago as a result. With wine, it's this connection to the land. And to, serving wine with dinner and inviting people over. And it's this kind of way to have initiate
Communal.
conversation, and yeah, it's very communal. It's just this way to bringing people together, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to do that. So the two of them together, and wine is so finicky. You know, who knows how many wines there are out there, and you just you get in, and somebody can say, I've had a ton of Chardonnay. Well, I guarantee you there are 1,000 different kinds of Chardonnay that you have not had. Variety, there are different vineyards that are doing so many interesting things, and they're creating the wine in a very different way. And so it's the uniqueness of every bottle, even from the same winery, from the same plot of land. That bottle of wine from this year is totally different from the bottle of wine that was created in 2015, and that's different than the bottle of wine that will be created in 2025. So it's just more of this thing about the uniqueness of the wine, the uniqueness of us as human beings, and how take the time to get to know us, get to know the bottle, get to know the wine.
I was just going to say, it almost sounds like people. I was just going to, you said it was like people, but I was thinking that exactly in my head. It sounds like people.
Yeah, definitely. So that's what I'm reading. I'm sorry, I don't have any, I can't sit here and tell you that I'm reading some grand treatise on on fundraising or something like that. I'm way more base at this point.
No, that's awesome. Actually, I think that's fascinating that you have like those passions, even though you work in a field that requires so much passion too. All right, well, I'm going to jump into a couple of questions from the audience that I have here. So the first one I have for you is, hi, Kevin, in your work, do you have conversations with Native American tribes? And if so, how has that gone with respect to climate change activity?
Yeah, I actually have been talking to folks from tribes. I've been doing quite a bit of work on oceans, and that will probably continue. That will become a new areas at some point for Nature for Justice. Thinking about, and there I've been talking with a few folks in this space. The conversations with tribes are quite different than the conversations that we have with Black and Latino Asian communities here in the U.S. Because you're talking with tribes, you're talking about government to government conversations. I mean, that's a different relationship. Yeah. And so I've been learning a lot about what constitutes that conversation and how to have those conversations and how to be a part of those discussions. And there's a ton more to learn. I will tell you, people are people, and we all want the same stuff. And we want, some agency to control the things that impact our lives. We want, access to, let's say, food. You want access to clean environment, to things that are going to allow us to fully live our lives. We want to be respected. We want to be part. We want to have that agency. So that is very similar, and that's not different. The cultures are different, but they drive towards some of the same things that we as people want. So it's been a really interesting learning process, and like I said, there's still a ton for me to learn around those issues.
Well, this question ties into that a little bit. It's more specific, but this person says that's a huge amount of work you're doing, Kevin. So they agree. By any chance, have you had discussions with senators or their staff with respect to Native American tribes' needs for renewable energy specifically, or any of the other climate-related, environmental-related aspects? And this person also mentions specifically in Alaska.
Yeah, so we have talked with a few Alaska tribes. I'm really appreciative, friends like the ones we have at Coeric. Those are the kinds of relation. We've started to build some of those relationships. Have not spoken directly to senators in the lobbying, not say lobbying,
in an educational in an educational format. I think we are. I think we're well poised to have some of those conversations going forward, and certainly looking to extend some of the very cursory discussions that I've had with a few members of Congress over the past 3 or 4 months. I think it's. I do think. I think it's important to understand too the role that Nature for Justice plays. Even better than me having a conversation with members of Congress, I want to go sit down with a member of Congress and bring along my colleagues from, if we're doing the farming work here in North Carolina, I want to bring my colleagues from the Lumbee tribe. I want to bring folks from these communities in Eastern North Carolina and let them talk.
Yeah, you want to be there to support them, but let them talk and have the conversation, right. And you're just there to be with them and support them. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's awesome. Well, and this is part of the same conversation. This question that we have here is, how has Nature for Justice, how have you personally identified, the groups that you're going to talk to, and how do you find them, and how do you figure out which partners you're going to pair together, because they're interested in what each other needs? Like, how does that process go for you?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, it's been weird in the age of COVID. We haven't been able to. One of the reasons I'm on the road so much now is because I haven't been able to be on the road for the first 4 months of work that we've been doing. We've been doing a lot of researching, kind of getting on the phone and talking to people, sending emails and having Zoom meetings, but there's nothing that beats getting out in front of people on the ground, shaking hands, talking to folks directly so that they see your full body language, you see theirs, they know how you are bought into the work that you're doing and that you're proposing to do with them. So it's actually been kind of difficult, to be honest, up front. I think, what we've been doing is trying to do a lot of research and understand who the organizations that are out there doing really good work. There are a ton, and it's hard to get out there and talk to all of them. Some of it has been just word of mouth. Hey, you should talk to this person. You should talk to that person. You should talk to this group. And so we're starting to do some of that. And, we'll continue to build these relationships. I think what we want to do, like I said a little bit earlier, is really be connectors to all these different groups that are doing great work, learn from different groups that are out there doing this work, and build upon it. Figure out how to scale that work up. We don't profess to have grand solutions to these problems. We figured the solutions are probably sitting out there somewhere. We just haven't figured out a way to get it scaled up. So let us find those solutions. We've got our theory of change. We've got some thoughts about how we scale those solutions. We have some connections to a few folks to address those access points that I mentioned earlier in our theory of change. Let's go with it.
Cool. So another question that came through is, and you've touched on it a couple times, could you expand a little bit on the kind of ocean advocacy work that you mentioned previously, and what Nature for Justice is thinking in that space, or what you're thinking in that space?
So I did a little work here last summer, working with a couple of organizations around thinking about how they want to address justice and equity within their own organizations. That led to some work this year with Capitol Hill Ocean Week, trying to shape that agenda for the events that took place a couple of weeks ago with Capitol Hill Ocean Week. I think we learned a few things out of that discussion. And kind of the broader discussions going forward. One, I think we learned there's a lot to be done in terms of shaping kind of where people are coming from, where organizations are coming from, in terms of what does it mean to embrace justice and equity within your organization. I think there needs to be a real conversation about that. What does it even mean to talk about justice and equity in the ocean advocacy space. So I think that's one piece. I think there are some legislative pieces that there's some policy pieces that could get moved. Can we start thinking about ocean governance? Are there opportunities for Democrats and Republicans to find some way to work together on ocean governance structures? And we ought to be thinking, let's think outside the box and figure out where there's some opportunities for collaboration. Think about this. Some of the outside of COVID relief programs, some of the biggest legislative wins in the last 2 years have been environmental. I mean, think about all the noise that the Land and Water Conservation Fund, permanent reauthorization and permanent appropriation. Think about what that garnered back here, in October of last year. Members of Congress were running out the door trying to take some credit for it. That was a place we were able to come together. We ought to be able to figure out ways to come together around some of these other issues related to climate, to ocean advocacy, to farming, to public lands. We need to figure out how to make certain that there's an understanding that in order to get a bill passed in 2021 and moving forward, justice and equity really need to be centered in that. So what does that look like? Let's start having those conversations. I think Nature for Justice can be a part of that. We can even be, we can be a part of that conversation. I think there's probably some work to do also on how we engage with communities. For us, it's not just a policy conversation at the federal level. It's really how do we engage with folks on the ground, working on really interesting, groundbreaking, innovative projects that may not involve government, but we help bring together resources, bring together partners to try to work on these issues. That's another place where we think we can have real impact. So on the ocean piece, maybe there's something around blue carbon, blue economy activities where we can start thinking about, well, how do some of these Black, Indigenous, people of color communities benefit from these programs if they're landowners? How do we benefit? And there are a number of them out there, and we should be thinking about how to make certain that they're able to benefit from some of these market-based programs. Should we be thinking about offshore wind and equity concerns? How do we start to bring those thoughts and ideas together? Making certain that equity and justice are part of the conversation around offshore wind development. I think there are a few different areas. There are a few other areas that, to be honest, we are scheduling a call next, a brainstorming session next week, so we can go haywire around and just throw stuff up on the wall and start to say, hey, there's so much out there. Let's think about what might be some of the best opportunities. And if you have an idea, please type that into the chat, and we can have a conversation about what that idea might look like.
There you go. No, absolutely. This has been a great conversation, and I wish we could keep going. But I do want to share a thank you that came through in the chat from a volunteer for answering that question earlier. Thank you, Kevin. I agree. Going to a member of Congress with members of the community or tribe is vital work. I really want to wish you great success because your work is right on and so necessary. So I just wanted to share that appreciation.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And as I said, I would love to keep going. I know we only have 45 minutes together. So, final quick question, any closing words of wisdom or reflections today?
Hey, folks, be open. Just be open. Be open to people, be open to ideas. Don't close anything off. Stay true to what you believe in, but be open to how to achieve it.
Thank you, Kevin. That's fantastic. Really, really appreciate having you today.
Thank you. I appreciate
everybody. It's been a great conversation. Thank you all for attending today. Here's a brief reminder of where you can find today's recording to share with those who couldn't join us live, as well as our education director, Brett Cease's email if you have any questions, comments, feedback. You can also find our website and Nature for Justice if you'd like to get more involved or active, as well as the registration link for next month's talks. We'll be back on next month, same time, same place. Thank you again to Kevin and all the important work that Nature for Justice is doing. put those comments in the chat, as he said, while you still have a moment. And stay safe, everybody, and be well.
Thank you,
Kevin.
both. Take care now.
Yes, you too. Good luck with your meetings today.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.